my name is Sue Parvis, and I'm an assistant professor at Warwick Business School. I'll move on to the format of the webinar. So we're going to be looking at the key syllabus areas of the CIMA E3 exam. We will then move on to the CIMA E3 exam itself and the approach to the questions and how I would recommend that you do the questions. Then we will move on to top tips, how I can help you to help study, revise, prepare for your exam. And finally, we will move on to questions that I will take from you guys, and we'll have a little student and answer question session together. So without further ado, let's move on to the breakdown of the syllabus. So the syllabus was updated with the addition of digital strategy in it. Some things have moved out, other things have moved on to other parts of the E line. So this pretty much adds on to knowledge that you already have from E1 and E2, but you're building on that knowledge to a more strategic perspective. So you will have more to do with strategy processes, with digital strategy and developing a digital strategy. You will have a little on the finance functions interaction with the organization. You'll have a little more on strategic control, generating strategic options, and then analyzing the ecosystem of an organization. So essentially, this course is about, okay, where are we now as an organization? Where do we want to be? And then how are we going to get there? And so in order for us to be able to have a strategy of how to get to someplace, we're going to need models that will help us to generate ideas. These models and frameworks will be the basis of how we then choose something. And we will assess our choice based on a framework, usually something like suitability, acceptability, and feasibility. And we will also look at strategic options of change. And so there is a little bit of a behavioral aspect involved over here, as in, if a strategy is going to be changed, then how are we going to manage that change behaviorally with the different functions and parts of the organization? So it's a very interesting course, and it gets you ready to actually be able to make strategic decisions within organizations. However, requires knowledge of models and frameworks. So I'll talk about strategy area A. Strategy area A is on strategy process. It's about 15% of the exam. It will focus on you being able to identify strategy and the purposes of strategy, the different types of strategy and the levels of strategy, and outlining how an organization could maybe go through emergent processes of arriving at their strategy. So particular areas of concern in this area with people who sit this exam has been knowledge gaps in being unable to identify or pick the correct options when they're looking at intended and emergent strategy and or analyzing of the ecosystem of an organization. Okay, so it's essentially one of the building blocks of the next section, which is analyzing and organizing, analyzing the organization's ecosystem. So when you go towards this part of the area, you've got to be able to use different models, which you will be familiar with from your E2 and your E1, but we're going to look at it in more detail in E3, where you're looking at things like a SWOT analysis and a PESTEL analysis and other analyses about your industry and your competitors, but you're going to need to be able to bring them together to then suggest or pick from a number of options what the correct strategy will be for the organization. Okay, so that's the analyzing markets and competitors and your regulation. You will then look at the drivers of change, and drivers of change come in different formats. They come in a larger notion of institutional drivers of change. Then you can have systemic drivers of change. There are social drivers of change, market drivers of change, technology drivers of change. And more recently, in the past decade, we've had more of a discussion on sustainability drivers of change. And this is where your knowledge of organizations and what's going on currently will help you pick, again, the correct drivers of change in a question that has options. And just being aware of the fact that sustainability is something that organizations are more concerned with now than they have ever been in the past. You have sustainability standards that have now become part of, usual reporting, which means that when you go and you sit your case study, you need to be able to link your F3, your E3, and your P3 together very well, and just be aware of the fact that there are sustainability standards that we have to abide by. We then have the impact of strategic networks and platforms on organizational strategy and stakeholder analyses. So when you're doing the impact of networks and platforms, this is again something that's a bit more new as organizations step to having more networks than they've ever had before. And obviously a stakeholder analyses as well, where you're trying to identify which ones of your stakeholders are more important or require a different type of information in order for you to be able to implement your strategy. Okay, so some common areas of concern over here again are, for example, not really understanding the role and importance of networks and platforms, and or not being able to identify key players and the effects of these key players on the business model of organizations. Okay, we move on to content area C. And this is where you are generating strategic options. So once you've sort of understood where you are by doing an analysis of the environment that the organization is in, and you're trying to get to where you want to, so you start generating some strategic options for this organization. So this involves, for example, how the role of governance and ethics is going to impact on strategy, how it's going to impact on the vision. How does the vision fit in with the strategy that we're possibly going to be recommending? And how does the strategy align with the values of the organization? So it's a lot more complicated than just saying, oh, well, this is what we should do, because everything is interlinked. That's the strategy, the vision, the mission, the values. All of these things need to align with the strategic option that you recommend. And so there is a way to frame strategic questions, and this part of the syllabus deals with how to frame strategic questions. How do we diagnose the current position? And then we make decisions based on that for our product mix, for our market mix, for even markets that we could possibly develop, or where should be the markets that we develop. What are the things that can go wrong? So we're going to look at forecasting the potential ecosystem. So a lot of generating strategic options now has to do with horizon planning. So you are looking at what is coming up in the next 5 years, let's say, or in the next 10 years. And then what can go wrong within this 5-year window, or what are the risks that can affect this organization? So we will do some scenario planning, which will incorporate the different scenarios of how things can pan out. Same with system modeling. We will use different frameworks to generate options then. So there's perspectives of game theory in here, and again, scenario planning in here. So this is probably for me the more interesting or most interesting part of the course, because you are taking information from a mini scenario in the exam and then applying your knowledge of the strategic options to it. Areas of concern over here is, because there are lots of models to learn over here, if the models are not learned, i.e. there is a knowledge gap, then there could be an inability to identify potential pathways for an organization and or new business models that should probably be developed. So we then have content area D. Content area D is where we move on to looking at options of criteria and recommending our appropriate options. So we look at, for example, we've got these strategic options now, but we need to assess them. So are they suitable? Are they acceptable? Are they feasible? We would also then conduct a value chain analysis. So we will look at what things are actually adding value or can be adding value, or are value adding activities based on the current situation of the organization where we want to be. We will also conduct portfolio analysis, so managing the overall product portfolio. And again, you have a little bit of stakeholder analysis in here as well. So you assess the options and you try and pick out from those options that appear to be more suitable or acceptable or feasible. And again, the areas of concern are a lack of knowledge of these models and a lack of knowledge of trade-offs between individual choices. And so, by going with option A, you're giving up certain things that option B brings. So just not having a knowledge of that means that you will not be able to pick the correct option in the exam. And this is about 15% of the weighting of the exam. Content area E is more about strategic control. So you see, once you've decided where you are and where you want to be, and then you've decided how you're going to get to where you want to be, you need to monitor how that's happening. And so that's a part of strategic control, where we develop detailed action plans. We'll look at communication and monitoring and implementation. So we're trying to align managers and functions together. So we come up with incentives, we do some target setting. In order to do the targets or achieve those targets, you then have a critical success factor. So we come up with a critical success path, which are small objectives that need to happen or things that need to take place in order for us to achieve one objective. And once those are set, we can then learn how we want to measure whether a certain objective was achieved or how well a particular objective was achieved. And we do that by setting KPIs, which are key performance indicators. Key performance indicators are a lot easier to assess when they are related to numbers and quantitative items, and far more difficult to develop and assess when they have to do with qualitative things. So again, with the introduction of digitization in strategy as well as sustainability, you might have questions that require you to apply your knowledge of sustainability with KPIs within a strategic control context. And so again, it's that understanding of what's going on that's going to help. Within this area, you will also be doing a lot of work in terms of advising on resource availability and allocation to strategic choices. So how are we allocating resources based on the plan that we have come up with through all of this analysis of our ecosystem and everything else. So, and based on what we currently have available, how are we going to allocate our resources to the strategic choices? This might require obviously doing a key resource audit. And so trying to, give the areas that require more resources more importance. And so providing them with more or less. And that all depends on the strategic choice that is being made. We must then be able to assess the impact of the strategy that we are choosing on the organization. And this is the more difficult part in terms of empirical application to real life scenarios, because if there is strategy change or a requirement for change, then there is usually a resistance to change. And so how are we going to manage that resistance to change? And or increase acceptability of a novel idea or an innovation without causing too much disruption within the organization. So that's what this deals with. And we could then recommend change management strategies, which includes different approaches and styles to change management. And finally, what will be the role of leaders in managing the change? This is about 20% of the syllabus, and again, it links in very well with the area of understanding strategic choices. And so it's very integral to the syllabus. It's very integral to being able to apply this empirically in real life. And areas of concerns are things like, well, we've got the strategic choice. Now, how do we mobilize it? How do we motivate? How do we incentivize and implement the plans that we have spent so long coming up with? A lot of organizations also pay consultancy firms to come up with these plans for them. So the plan might look great on paper, but then the implementation of it in practice is an area of concern. That can be difficult to do. In terms of your exam, it's making sure that the choice that is offered in a little mini scenario or whatever you're picking in terms of the impact on strategy links in well with the mini scenario that you're reading. I'll move on to content area F. This is the digital strategy part of the syllabus. It's the newer part that was introduced later on. and essentially is about developing the roles and responsibilities of higher management, so the board and the executive leadership in the digital strategy. Most organizations that are going to survive the next 10 to 15 years need to have developed a digital strategy of growth and how they're going to innovate and how they're going to have even a digital strategy. They must also analyze what digital technologies and enterprise they currently have. You will have heard of words like cloud computing, blockchain, 3D printing, DLT ledgers, and all of these are making organizations different. The organization of today is no longer similar to traditional organizations, and these digital technologies and therefore called Industry 4.0 because they're like an industrial revolution that has happened. And it's the scale and scope of this industrial revolution far outweighs the scale and scope of any other industrial revolution that has happened in the past. And so just understanding that, for example, the technology behind cryptocurrency, which is blockchain, can be used in different contexts, like, for example, smart contracts, and how smart contracts can then impact the business model of an organization that deals with asset management is crucial. So, just understanding that digitization and digital technologies are going to have an impact on business models, on strategy, and organizations need to be ready for this. Then, obviously, understanding or discussing the economies of digitization and ecosystems and digital consumption. So the fact that we produce so much big data and that this can be harnessed and this can be used, so others' digital consumption can be used because that data is just sitting there now. And so organizations need to get ready or need to probably plan on how they want to get ready on harnessing the strength of this big data. Every click, every image that you share, everything that you like, anything that you do on all of the different apps that you use is leaving a trail out there. And there is a digital ecosystem out there that can be used by organizations, and they must develop a strategy for that. And then you've got the data and metrics. So this is where I said the active usage that you have, the way that you use your different apps is being recorded somewhere. And so we have to then come up with new metrics that we can use. For example, the concept of engagement can be used, and it is being used within academia and elsewhere where we can monitor the levels of engagement by how long people spend on a YouTube video, when do people click off a YouTube video, what was the context of the subject that was being discussed when people clicked off. Same with webinars. So when do people stop moving their mouse? I don't know. What is it that we can do then? When knowing that, what is it that we can do then to engage people more? And that just depends on the organization and its products. But essentially, there has to be a level of engagement, whether that is through buying habits, whether that is through consumer behavior, whatever it is, this can be impacted through knowing that data and metrics. And then obviously we want to have leadership in digital transformation because organizations are now all pretty much going through this process of transformation. We need good leaders to emerge in order to allow for this to happen. And in order to allow for this to happen, bearing in mind that, AI is no longer something that can be ignored, and it's coming up in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So in terms of your exam, areas of concern are knowledge gaps. So not understanding the key trends or the underlying organization's product, and then what data and metrics can be used to evaluate the success of a digital enterprise policy and or system technology that is applied in the scenario. I would say that this is probably something that less so for the actual CIMA E3, but you'll use a lot of this for your case study that you will sit after this. Right, so let's move on to, now that we've discussed the syllabus areas, we can move on to the actual exam. Don't know why that has come up as blank, but you've got computer-based exam. It's available on demand. You've got 90 minutes, which means that you'll be doing about 10 questions per 15 minutes, and there is no partial marking. There is a scale score. The way that I would recommend sitting the exams is obviously right before you sit your case study because there's things and models to remember, but probably after CIMA F3 and P3. The question formats that you will get are very similar to before. So you'll get multiple choice and response, where you will need to choose the correct answer or answers from a list. You could have drag and drop, where you'll be tasked with moving an object and labeling it. Hotspot, where you're asked to identify an area on an image by clicking on it, and or drop down, where you'll be prompted to select the correct answer from a drop down menu and or choices. So the keys to success are that you want to look out for important words and you want to read the whole question carefully. So look out for words like not, always, most, best, never, least, and worst, because a lot of the time in these questions where they're asking you for the most or the best or the least of something, 3 out of 4 of those options will make sense. But you want to pick the one that makes the most / the least sense. And so the way that you go about doing that is you read the entire question, you formulate your response before you read the options. This is very important. You don't read the options. First, you read the question and you think of what the response will be. Then you go and you read the options. You read all of the available options, and then you select the most appropriate option. You've been doing this for all of your exams, so you will be familiar with this. I wouldn't stop when I think I've reached the correct answer, which is why I've got all in capital, because I think reading all the options is very important. You can have a question like this, for example, where it says ABC Limited is considering a merger with a smaller company to enhance its market share and diversify its product portfolio. Which of the following factors should be the primary focus of due diligence before proceeding with the merger? So I will focus on certain words. So for example, over here, I've got merger. It's a smaller company. They're trying to enhance their market share, and they're asking for something that should be the primary focus. So if I read through this list, and if I read through all of this list, compatibility of corporate cultures seems fair. Potential for cost savings through economies of scale seems fair. Financial health seems fair. Potential market reaction to the merger announcement also seems fair. So how do I pick the correct option over here? So although all of the factors that are listed are important, the financial health of the smaller company is probably the most critical aspect to examine during due diligence. So because this will ensure that the smaller company is not carrying significant liabilities or risks that could negatively impact the company post-merger. So what you do is you start ruling out the answers that you think are definitely incorrect, which I said, well, it looks like all 4 are correct. You can look for conflicting and or agreeing answers. Conflicting options cannot both be correct, and options that agree with one another sometimes are either all correct or all incorrect. So I would have picked the financial health of the smaller company in this instance, because it's more to do with due diligence at a merger stage. Okay. And so it's more about practicing. So the approach that you want to take is think of an answer before you actually pick an option, and read, obviously, all of the options that are available. If you really don't know the answer to a question, then you can go through this list that I've provided, where you start ruling out the definitely wrong ones. Okay. So in terms of your approach to the exam, I wouldn't have a linear approach when I'm attempting the exam. I wouldn't have to take question 1 first, then go to question 2. And I would sort of go through the exam in rounds, where I'd say, okay, in my first round, I'm going to do the short and easy questions. So I'm focusing on gathering as many marks as I can, as quickly as I can. And I will spend about 10 or 15 minutes doing this, flag the rest. Then in my second round of going through the exam, I will go through the questions that I find are longer, but are easier questions. And so I will do the longer ones that I am confident I know the answer, but would have probably taken me a little bit of more time to do or to assess. And I will again flag the rest for review. When it comes to my third round, I will do questions that I'm not comfortable with. And I will focus on the questions that require maybe a little bit of more consideration, but I wouldn't spend too much time on this again, because the idea is that I want to answer all of the questions. Remember that there is no negative marking, right? So you're far better off answering more questions than you are trying to make sure that the ones that you've answered are correct. Because it's now you have a higher chance of getting something right by attempting all of the questions that are possible. And so what you will do is you will attempt all of the questions, which then leads me to the fact that time is of the essence here. Time is very important. Okay. There's no negative marking, as I said. So you want to attempt all of the questions, but also you want to make sure you're not wasting too much time, which is why I would go through the exam in the way that I said I would go through the exam, where I would go through round 1, then I will go through round 2, and then I will go through round 3. And the idea is that you shouldn't panic. When you see possibly a question that you may not know the answer to immediately, you can leave it and move on. Don't let that panic you and for you to waste time reading it and trying to understand it. So this is where knowledge gaps become evident. And so there is no way that you should pass this exam, or you could pass this exam by limiting your study to particular areas. Instead, you have to make sure that you can cover the whole syllabus and then pay attention to the areas that have more of a weighting, because you will get more questions from those areas. So that's how I would approach the question. My top tips to help you pass are essentially to book your exam in advance, practice doing 30 questions in 30 minutes, take full mock tests and feedback, and revise the core units that you are weak in, because you want to make sure by the time you get to the exam that you're not actually weak at anything. I'll move on to what you get with Learn Signal, and you've got a number of services that you get with Learn Signal, like objective test and case study exams. You get unlimited tutor support. You've got interactive study plans. You've got expert lecturers that will provide you with notes that you can download and mark up. You've got Q&A sessions, boot camp, Kickstart packages, as well as a WhatsApp group that is CIMA level specific, so you're not thrown into a CIMA WhatsApp group with everyone else. You'll have your own individual groups, so that's something that I would consider. If you're looking for resources to help you with past CIMA, you've got this QR code on the screen, which allows you to register and stay updated for whenever a sale might happen. And finally, our students have quite a bit of success. We've got our results over here for you guys. So you've got the MCS 24 exam results, E3 and P3 and F3. You've got the ratings that you can see over here. And essentially, by doing more questions, you're putting yourself in a position of being able to pass this exam. So my recommendation for anything that you do is that.